have to look at the objectives which the Israelis have set themselves and that the war cabinet has said. So it's obviously the destruction of Hamas's military capability. That is probably achievable. It's the destruction of Hamas as the governing entity in Gaza. That is achievable. It is protecting the civilian population over the border. That is probably achievable. And as a subset of that, of course, it's getting the hostages out. Those are the four main things that the Israeli war cabinet have stated. So all those are achievable, but they are military objectives. And the object of war is a better peace. It doesn't get you to the strategy bridge between political intent and military power. So what is the end state in terms of what will follow in terms of when the war concludes, which it will. Now, it might be that we have a very kinetic phase for however long it might be. Historically, the Israelis in 2008, 2014 in Gaza have gone in for 18 days with 5 brigades. I suspect it will be longer than that and with more power. But has the diplomatic dance, which has been going on at the moment, been involved about what do we do at the end? Who goes in and governs Gaza? Because it certainly can't be Hamas.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Alex Dibble. We are discussing the ongoing conflict in Israel with former British military advisor to the US Central Command, Major General Chapman, who served 33 years in the armed forces. He is a well-known commentator on geopolitics and security and has authored the book Notes on a Small Military. Major General Chapman, thanks so much for joining Frontline.
Thank you, Alex.
First question I think that is pertinent at the moment is we understand Israel are considering an invasion of the Gaza Strip. When that will happen, we don't know. When do you think it will happen, and what is the significance of the timing of it?
Well, I think there are 3 factors at the moment. The first one is that the diplomatic dance, political dance needs to play out. We've already had 2 P5 members there with President Biden and Rishi Sunak. We think that President Macron is going to be going in the next 24 to 36 hours. So I think that's important from a geopolitical perspective for that war to take place. The second one is that it gives you more time to try and get some sort of intelligence on where the hostages are. So it might not be a given that they will go in straight after that diplomatic dance has occurred. If they do think there's a chance of more intelligence development to go and rescue hostages, I think they might put it back 2 or 3 days to allow that to take place, not only for the hostages, but it also gives them more of an intelligence soak over the entire area to try and map out how they will do business in the future and make sure the battle procedure in terms of the orders are passed all the way down. Now, I say that because obviously Gaza City and a lot of Gaza itself are not the same in geographical terms as they were on the 7th of October. So having up-to-date air photography, making sure that your mapping's all good is going to be incredibly useful for the future. And that's also one of the things which is how the Israelis are probably going to fight. So they talk about using the smart suite or the smart suit. That is that they'll use the power of sensors and intelligence to try and do most of the heavy lifting with the overhead ability that they have, both in terms of drones, air power and satellite power. Because one of the extraordinary things they did in the 2021 conflict, it wasn't a ground invasion, but how they used intelligence was to use the power of supercomputing and machine learning allied to satellite photography to almost in real time see and analyze and strike rocket systems, mortar systems, anti-tank systems. And that is what they will try to do. One of the strengths of Hamas is their stealth. As soon as they pop up and are no longer stealthy, that is a weakness, and that's a weakness that Israel will exploit.
And how significant at this stage are the conversations Israel will be having with its allies prior to any invasion of Gaza?
Well, I think they're important from the global audience. So my old boss in Tampa, General Mattis, always used to say that capturing the perceptions of foreign audiences will replace seizing terrain as the new high ground. We saw that in the last 24 hours with the strike, whoever did it, on the hospital in Gaza. Now, it doesn't actually really matter who did it from one perspective. Of course, it does in terms of just war theory, because people will entrench into their silos about what they believe, and you can produce all the evidence that you want to confirm it was Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Israel on the other side. But a thing called belief perseverance will kick in when people just won't believe that that's the evidence that you're giving them. So that's the first thing. So it's very important in just war theory that Israel tries to prosecute a campaign that does take cognizance of non-combatant immunity. Now, this is a wicked area for them. So non-combatant immunity should mean that the very young, the very old, the sick, and those who can't take part in the manufacturing part of war should be spared from the terrible things which will occur, because war is a nasty business. That also, in terms of Gaza, creates a dilemma, because who is an innocent? Let me give you an example from the Second World War, where Leonard Cheshire, VC, the Bomber Command, rather like the Israelis, instead of door knocking, which the Israelis do by putting an armed sort of missile just to warn people to get out, allied with social media or leaflet dropping. In the Second World War, Leonard Cheshire would fly low over a building, the classic one being the Limoges Aero Engine factory in France. Now, what's actually more important? Is it the people who manufacture the weapons, the rocket systems? They might be civilians, or is it the factory? You could argue that both need to be taken out, because you can replace the factory. You can't replace the people if they're very skilled. And that is the difficulty for the Israelis in terms of targeting. So again, in terms of targeting, they talk about using proportionality and distinction between who is a Hamas guerrilla and a civilian, but with due regard to military necessity. Now, trying to square what is that triangle is a very, very complex and difficult thing to do.
There's a lot we're going to go into before we finish up Frontline today, but you've spoken there about Israel's distinction between the civilian population of Gaza and the Hamas fighters. They have said that they want to eradicate Hamas in response to the terror attack a couple of weekends ago. They have said that they want to eradicate Hamas. Does Israel have the capability to actually do that?
Well, there's two different questions there in a way. So the first thing is you have to look at the objectives which the Israelis have set themselves and that the War Cabinet has said. So it's obviously the destruction of Hamas's military capability. That is probably achievable. It's the destruction of Hamas as the governing entity in Gaza. That is achievable. It is protecting the civilian population over the border. That is probably achievable. And as a subset of that, of course, it's getting the hostages out. Those are the four main things that the Israeli War Cabinet have stated. So all those are achievable, but they are military objectives. And the object of war is a better peace. It doesn't get you to the strategy bridge between political intent and military power. So what is the end state in terms of what will follow in terms of when the war concludes, which it will? Now, it might be that we have a very kinetic phase for however long it might be. Historically, the Israelis in 2008, 2014 in Gaza have gone in for 18 days with 5 brigades. I suspect it will be longer than that and with more power. But has the diplomatic dance, which has been going on at the moment, been involved about what do we do at the end? Who goes in and governs Gaza? Because it certainly can't be Hamas.
Let's talk a little bit about what might Israel be faced with if and when they go into Gaza. There's been a lot of talk about the sort of traps that Hamas might leave, but also what they may have to deal with as Israeli fighters, Israeli soldiers, snipers, Hamas fighters blending into the population and then suddenly becoming Hamas fighters again. What will it be like for Israel's forces to go in? What will be the challenges?
Well, that is the nightmare, of course, of distinction, and why the Israelis have quite rightly, from a military perspective, asked the people of Gaza City to move to the south to near the Rafah crossing. Now, again, you could argue that those who haven't left could be a target. Stand fast what I said earlier on, of course, about women, children, sick and the infirm, and hospitals would not, for example, be a target, kindergartens and things like that. But you've really got three battles going on. You've got the subterranean battle, possibly. We know that the Israelis in 2021, when they didn't go in a grand invasion, managed to destroy 100 kilometers of tunnels in Gaza. We think that there may be up to 500 kilometers of tunnels, which is extraordinary because that's like the London Underground plus. So you've got the subterranean battle, which will cause a lot of problems. Doesn't mean you have to go in there in great numbers. You might be able to use drones, remote means to go there. You might actually collapse them by using bombs which actually compress the earth, so you collapse them in another way. You might flood them from seawater. There's a number of things that you could do. And again, this has always been a sort of sword versus shield type thing between Israel and Hamas. Because the Israelis, and with lots of technical means, were able to uncover quite a lot of the Gaza Metro, as they called it, in 2021, a way of negating that from Hamas's side has been to dig them deeper, to try and negate that capability. Now, I don't know at the moment whether that means that the technical capability of the Israelis has been negated to a certain degree. We'll certainly find out in the next few weeks. So the subterranean one is the first one. So that's consistent with how Israel think that Hamas will fight in terms of their strength, is stealth, defense, and hiding. But as soon as you have to go above surface to either fire an anti-tank weapon or a rocket, then you're in the eyesight or gun sight of the Israelis. So that is the weakness. So on the above or the surface, I think it was interesting what we saw with the capability that Hamas took into Israel itself. Now, if you look, which people like me do, at, for example, the worst case Fedayeen type scenario, that's a sort of commando type freedom fighter from their perspective, with the Mumbai attacks in 2011. We talk about either marauding intent, marauding pairs of people, or seize and hold. Now, from the armaments that were captured from the incursions from Hamas, you can almost say that the Hamas were trying to do a seize and hold. You've got anti-tank mines, you've got EFP, these are projectiles which are off-route mines, always used, and the technology comes from the Iranians there, heavily used by the Taliban with Iranian technology in the campaign there. And these are all things that the Israelis are going to be very, very wary of. Now, the best counter to that is armour. They will go in with all their armour. And I think it's significant that for the first time, I think since at least 73, that all the Israeli armour in their inventory has been called up, and it's somewhere near 1,000 tanks, not just for the Southern Command, the area around Gaza, but also, of course, for the Golan Heights and the Northern Command to make sure any incursion from Hezbollah, from Lebanon, is minimised.
I know this is a notoriously difficult question to answer, but how many fighters does Hamas have? Do we know? And is it a significant element of this war, or is it the tactics really rather than the numbers that are going to make the difference?
Well, Israeli intelligence would suggest that Hamas is somewhere in the order of 30,000 people. Hamas themselves claim 40,000 people. Now, of course, one of the things is what's the state of their training. There's always a variable before war, which is, will they fight, how well will they fight, and for how long will they fight? So was the first echelon, which has effectively been wiped out, those who went into Israel on the 7th of October, were they the real hardcore, well-trained, tested fighters? And will they be relying in subsequent weeks, with each week of attrition, on a weaker cadre of people, less well-trained, not necessarily with less intent? Because one of the things which is both in Israeli doctrine and in Iranian and therefore Hamas and Hezbollah doctrine is in Israel, it's consciousness of purpose. Why are we fighting? It's quite clear this is existential from an Israeli perspective. From an Iranian perspective, and therefore Hamas and Hezbollah, they talk about Alavi doctrine, which is using religious indoctrination to ensure that people fight to the end by believing in their faith.
You referenced the four elements from an Israeli perspective, what they're looking to try and achieve with any invasion of Gaza, one of which being the rescue of those hostages. Even today, we've had a representative of Hamas on Times Radio say that he doesn't know how many of those hostages are still alive. Do you think that reveals any sort of disorganization or chaos within Hamas as an organization, or simply could it be that it's difficult in this kind of scenario for anybody within an organization like that in this sort of conflict to have all the information at their fingertips?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult for them. So, for example, if they had a hierarchical command and control system, that could be absolutely interdicted very, very quickly by the Israelis, who could cut them off. So they need to have discrete elements of capability slung around the police. So it wouldn't surprise me that the sort of top hierarchy probably doesn't know where half of them are. That would also be a good thing from an operational security point of view, from a Hamas perspective. Now, we think from what they said about 4 or 5 days ago, when 13 were supposedly killed in 7 locations, maybe that gives us an indication that they might be being held in pairs, and therefore you could argue that you're looking at 75 to 100 different sites. That would cause a huge problem in trying to locate and rescue those. Certainly you couldn't do that simultaneously. You'd have to do it sequentially, and the risks are, of course, amplified after you've taken the first of the Hamas start killing the second, third, and all the way down. So it's a really difficult one. Now, I do think there will be diplomatic offices still in train to try and sort this out, and I think the offices of Qatar are being used here, have in the past. But one of the objectives of Hamas, certainly at the tactical level on the 7th of July, was to use the Israeli hostages as a means of releasing all the Palestinian prisoners. If they were to achieve that, that would possibly make them the top dog in the resistance framework within Israel. And one of their other objectives was, of course, and still is, to supplant the accommodationist Palestinian Authority, those who govern parts of the West Bank.
Let's talk a little bit about, you've mentioned Hezbollah a couple of times. Let's talk a bit about Hezbollah as an organization as well as a group. How does it compare to Hamas for people who might not know a great deal about it? Are they incredibly similar or are they very different? And I suppose in particular, in terms of their military capability.
Well, I think first you have to go back to what happened in the immediate years after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. That really is the sort of key date when the government which came in, the theocracy in Iran, stated its aim to have a sort of revolutionary fervour in the Sunni world. And it was that which led first to the formation of Hezbollah in 1982 and also to Hamas in 1987. What's unusual is that Hamas is actually an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. That is a Sunni organisation. It is not a Shia organisation. Now, in terms of quality and quantity, Hezbollah are a lot larger than Hamas. It could be that they have 20,000 regulars, 20,000 reserves. Nasrallah, their political leader, says they have up to 100,000. They're very strong, obviously, in southern Lebanon, the Shia stronghold, the Bekaa Valley, and in Beirut. They have far more combat capability than Hamas for one simple reason, and that is that they've been fighting on behalf of Iran in the Syrian civil war since sort of 2012 onwards. They've also sustained quite heavy losses there, so it could be that their get up and go has been a bit circumscribed by the fact that they did take so many losses in that conflict. The key difference in terms of the geography and what that means in supply from Iran, and Iran supports Hezbollah with about $700 million worth of support a year, is what the Israelis for a number of years have called the precision project. So Hamas have a number of rockets, not that many, well, we'll call it 10,000, maybe 6,000 have been fired at the moment, and the only thing which doesn't seem to be in short supply in Gaza is the rockets. But most of those rockets are Katyusha 107 and 122 millimeter rockets. They are not they're not going to knock out your critical national infrastructure and things like that. The precision project, which Iran sponsored into with Hezbollah, was bringing stuff through both Aleppo and Damascus airport via Syria to build up this ballistic missile and other capability. And the number of rockets we think they have is of the order of 150,000. Now, should they fire a significant number of those on a significant number of days, planning factor is 4,000 a day, it is the defense of the critical national infrastructure and things like the Israeli airfields and the Dimona nuclear site, which are the critical thing. That is, I think, one of the reasons that those 26 settlements were also evacuated from the border area of the Northern Command about 3 or 4 days ago, because Israel can't be strong everywhere in protecting everything with its integrated air defense system. It has to prioritize, and some of those things I've just mentioned about critical national infrastructure are the things they need to go, because it's then that the Air Force bases will have to do the heavy lifting against the rocket sites, launch sites, and things like that.
You actually touched on it halfway through that very helpful explanation. But I was going to ask you about funding. War is a very expensive thing, as we know. Hamas and Hezbollah, where is their funding coming from? How deep are their pockets? And is that significant at all in terms of the conflict that we're seeing at the moment and how long it may go on for?
It is, not only because of the overt funding that you know about, and I mentioned the funding from Iran, but also in these days, the Israelis, in terms of their operational concept for victory, the 2020 paper, don't just talk about land, sea, and air. They talk about the multi-domain. And the multi-domain here also includes cyber in terms of cutting off funding via, for example, cryptocurrencies. Now, there are a lot of supporters in the Middle East and elsewhere who will use sort of covert funding, the dark net and things like that to support these revolutionary sort of movements. And that is another avenue that Israel needs to cut off to be successful. Now, as long as you're supplied with some weaponry and can do enough damage, we generally say that total means, your total physical means, multiplied by your strength of will, gives you your power of resistance. That is the real problem for Israel ultimately. They can destroy the physical means of Hamas and Hezbollah. They probably can't destroy the will, and there'll still be some power of resistance. And that is why ultimately we need to get this into the political arena. That's not possible, of course, with those organizations because they are rejectionist, exterminationist organizations. The only one party state that they want to see in Israel is one where you have a Shia regime with the Israelis expelled, and that cannot be on the agenda.
You've spoken about politics there, and we've seen Joe Biden visit. We've seen Rishi Sunak visit now. You mentioned right at the start Emmanuel Macron. And I suppose the big concern from them and around the world will be the dragging in, if that, for want of a better phrase, of Iran to this conflict on a wider level. How likely is that? We've had some language even in the last couple of days to suggest that this conflict is now out of control and what happens next is sort of out of anybody's hands. And how serious could it be in terms of the wider region if indeed Iran does become much more fully involved?
Well, the historian of my youth was A.J.P. Taylor, who used to say that nothing is inevitable until it happens. There is an impulse to go to war and invade from the Israelis for really three good reasons. So someone like me, well versed in military philosophy, will tell you that there are only three causes of war which come from Thucydides 2,500 years ago: fear, honour, and interest, vital interest. Now, all three of those seem to be present at the moment, and that can give you a toxic propellant towards going certainly to into Gaza. And then you have to look at the decision points for the other entities. So going into Gaza is deemed to be the decision point for Hezbollah joining. So you might then have the Northern Front erupting. Were Israel then to be supported overtly by America, either by using air power from its carrier groups or taking down some of the ballistic missiles I mentioned with their Aegis cruisers, which would be supporting the carrier groups, then that might be a red line for Iran to activate other entities. And by other entities, I mean what they call the unity of fronts. So the unity of fronts includes Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Now, the Houthis are a group in the Yemen. They also have some long-range missiles, and of course we know this because they targeted the Saudi oil installations, because there is an ongoing war, of course, civil war in Yemen, of which Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been a protagonist since 2015. The key final one, of course, is does Iran join, or does it just use its proxies? Now, I think they would only join if there were overt attacks on the Iranian homeland. And there is a risk for the Iranians as well, because one of the things which has been pretty absent really from much of the discussion is, of course, there has been a slight, quite a big uprising in lots of ways in the last year in Iran, led by the women under the rubric of women, life, freedom. And the Iranians have killed a lot of their own people. And it could be that this actually becomes a catalyst for a revolution itself in Iran, and the people in Iran throwing off the shackles of their theocracy. So there are internal calculations as well as external calculations for Iran to consider.
I want to end as we get towards the end. Slightly more personal. You spent 33 years serving the British Armed Forces. If you were an Israeli soldier or an Israeli commander at this time, how would you be feeling, and what would be the things that you would be most concerned about and most terrified of?
Well, every day is a bad day when you're in war, because you don't know if it's going to be your last. You have to have the cohesion and strength of will, and ultimately the sort of brotherhood around you, cohesion about mates and matehood. That's the thing which sustains people. You know that you might die. That's what happens in war. I think what's interesting is I actually have been to Gaza and the West Bank and to Israel, and I was in just coming out of the Wailing War when a big bomb went off and killed quite a number of people in 2002. We were doing some confidence building measures between Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. We looked at each other and said, that's the end of it. Israel will do something now, and all the work we've done is to naught. And that's exactly what happened.
And so, from the point of view of those who are fighting and what they're going to be feeling and what they're going to be concerned about, what is the hope, almost maybe beyond hope, in this situation, if there is any?
Well, the hope ultimately is that the object of war, as I think I started at the beginning, is a better peace. What I'd like to see is a better peace for all sides, where you can be co-religionists working together in the same space, which actually was the original vision both of the Zionist movement and the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Major General Chip Chapman, thanks so much for joining us on Frontline. It's been fascinating to get your insights. There is so much more we could talk about, and perhaps we will have another opportunity soon, because very, very sadly, it doesn't look like this conflict, indeed this war, is going to be resolved anytime soon. But very much appreciate your expertise. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline from Times Radio. Remember, for the latest on the Israel conflict, you can go to the Times website, thetimes.co.uk. Also listen to Times Radio, which is interviewing significant people who are involved in the conflict every single day. And for the very latest too, you can listen to the Times World in 10 podcast. The World in 10 collates the very best of the Times and Times Radio, speaks to its own guests as well in a 10-minute podcast covering world and international news, at the moment focused, as you would imagine, on the Israel conflict. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.